A journalist boards a homemade submarine to write an article on its inventor. However, she will never leave that submarine alive again. It sinks the next day, and her body is found weeks later, dismembered and buried at sea. This is the story of Kim Wall. Kim Wall was a freelance journalist. She wrote for multiple different publications. She wrote for the New York Times, The Guardian, Vice, and the South China Morning Post. And she covered articles from all around the world, including from North Korea. She was very respected in her field. She had 2 master's degrees from Columbia University, and she was very, very widely loved. Kim Wall once expressed that, "I want to know how the world works, and I hope to maybe learn enough one day to make a difference." However, Kim Wall disappeared on August 10th of this year, 2017. Kim Wall was boarding the 40-ton submarine that had been invented by Peter Madsen, and he is a Danish inventor. He has done previous things, but he had recently, I believe in 2008, crowdfunded the money to create his own submarine. And so Kim Wall was writing an article on this, and it was August 10th of 2017. Her boyfriend dropped her off, and she boarded the submarine. Now, Kim was supposed to meet with her boyfriend the following day, where she was supposed to be dropped off in the same area that she had actually boarded the submarine in. But when her boyfriend showed up and she was nowhere to be seen, he immediately reported her missing. So the immediate fears was that something had happened to the submarine, that it had gotten lost, that there had been an accident, and everyone was generally concerned for the safety of both Kim Wall and Peter Madsen, and they sent out some rescue service missions to kind of go over the area of this Copenhagen Bay, and they kind of searched a lot of space there. They were looking for the submarine. Now, it had been seen on August 11th from a lighthouse, and they kind of went with that information, and before long, they were finally able to make contact with Madsen. He did not mention anything about Kim Wall when they made contact, but it was just after this contact that they had with him that the submarine sank. And they were able to get to Madsen, and they were able to bring him back to shore and rescue him, but there was no sign of Kim Wall. Madsen's original story was that Kim had already been dropped off. He claimed that he dropped her off at a restaurant that was right near where she had originally boarded the submarine, and that was basically his story, that she had been dropped off and he had just, been out on his own, and then there was just something happened and the submarine sank, and he was just thankful that he was able to be rescued. The restaurant that Madsen said that he had dropped Kim off at actually had a lot of different cameras on it, so they had a lot of CCTV footage, and they immediately turned all of this over to the police after Madsen had claimed that that's where he had dropped her off. So they were hoping that they were going to be able to find some sort of evidence of Kim on this footage, and that they were going to know what direction she had possibly gone off in. However, it was the next day, on August 12th, that Madsen changed his story. This was during a judicial hearing following the sinking of his submarine. There was so many questions going on, especially because still nobody knew where Kim was. The last person to definitely have seen her alive was Madsen, and there were a lot of questions. And so there was a judicial hearing, and I don't really know how the legal system works over there, but there was a judicial hearing, and it was here that Madsen changed his story. Now, this information would not be released to the public until August 21st, but it was on August 12th that Madsen said that there had been a terrible accident on the submarine before it had sank. What Madsen claimed is that Kim was exiting the hatch, and as she was doing so, the hatch door fell down, and it hit her on the head and killed her. And Madsen said that he was panicked. He didn't know what to do. He was worried that he was going to be blamed for her death for whatever reason, and so he decided to give her a burial at sea. If anyone's been following this case, of course, keep in mind that there still has not been any sign of Kim Wall at this point when he is originally telling authorities this new story of what happened. So the sinking of the submarine was investigated. They did look over the wreckage, and it was determined that the submarine was actually sank deliberately. It had not been any sort of accident, that Madsen had deliberately decided to sink his homemade 40-ton submarine that he had literally worked on for years. So that was obviously immediately suspicious, especially because authorities already knew that he had changed his story just 2 days prior. It was announced that the submarine had been sank deliberately on August 14th, so it didn't take them very long to kind of come to this conclusion. It was on August 21st that a cyclist found a human torso, and they were able to determine that this torso belonged to Kim Wall. It was only the torso, the head, and the limbs had been removed. And after an autopsy, they were able to determine that the head and the limbs had been cut deliberately. They had been deliberately removed from her body, and that there were stab wounds to her rib cage and her genital areas. And it was just all very suspicious. And of course, still the last person to have seen Kim Wall alive was Madsen. And he, of course, had already said at this point that he had not actually dropped her off anywhere, that she had died on the submarine. And so now authorities were trying to figure out, well, if it had been some sort of accident, why was she dismembered? Why were there stab wounds? It was all very strange. So on October 3rd, some new information came out, and this was all actually directly related to Peter Madsen himself. It was determined that a hard drive that was in his possession, it belonged to him. I don't know if it was, in his residence or if it was something he had with him when he was rescued from the submarine. I don't know that specifically, but the important information is that it belonged to Madsen, and there were some very disturbing things found on the hard drive. So on October 3rd, they announced all this, and it was said that there was footage and photos of women being burned, tortured, and decapitated while still alive, all on this hard drive that he had. And of course, Madsen tried to claim that, none of that was his. It was his hard drive, but the content on it wasn't his. And he said that at the laboratory that he worked at, that everyone there had access to that hard drive. So he was, of course, trying to say that, somebody else must have put all of that on there. It can't possibly be mine. But it definitely adds to the level of suspicion in this case. Yeah, so it was on October 6th that police divers were able to locate essentially the rest of Kim Wall's remains. Her arms, her legs, her head had all been recovered, as well as the clothing that she had been wearing. They had all been placed in separate bags, and they had all been weighed down with different pieces of metal scraps and like pieces from cars and whatnot. And they had all been weighed down in obviously the hopes that they wouldn't be found. From what I can find, they were not like all in the same place. They were scattered throughout this bay area where she had basically been buried at sea. And I've been following this case since it first cropped up. I've been watching all of the articles that come up about it on BBC News, which is where the majority of my information is coming from, though I have checked a bunch of other sources. It's really all the same. So, of course, as always, all of my source information will be pinned to the top of the comments down below if you guys wanted to check that out for yourselves. But yeah, so her head and her limbs were found, and they went back, they did an autopsy with all of the pieces of Kim's remains, and they were able to determine that there was in fact no type of head injury at all. There was no fracture, no other sort of injury that could be found at all on Kim's skull. So quickly they were able to rule out the idea that Madsen had been trying to throw around, that he had only buried her at sea because she had died of an accident when the hatch lid fell and hit her in the head. So this is where things get even more strange. It's just honestly such a strange case. And I feel like at this point, there's no reason for Madsen to still be telling the stories that he's telling. But to this day, he's still trying to say that he didn't kill Kim. He had nothing to do with it. None of the evidence that has been found has anything to do with him, like the hard drive, or, the fact that she was stabbed and dismembered. Like, he didn't have anything to do with that, is basically what he's trying to say. So at this point, Madsen has been charged with murder, sexual assault without intercourse, and the mutilation of a body. He denies all of these charges. He says that he had nothing to do with any of it. On October 30th, though, he changed his story yet again. He decided to come out and say that Kim had actually died on the submarine of carbon monoxide poisoning while she was sealed in the submarine, and he had happened to just be up on deck for whatever reason. I don't know anything about submarines, so I don't know if there's a reason that he would be up there, but she wouldn't be, especially if she was there solely for the purpose of writing an article about him and his submarine. But he's trying to claim that Kim died of carbon monoxide poisoning while he was up on deck and she was actually in the submarine, and that, for whatever reason, he decided to dismember her and bury her at sea. So the interesting thing about his stories is that he didn't even admit to having dismembered her body until October 30th, when he came out with his newest story about what had happened. Prior to that, he still claimed that he had absolutely nothing to do with the dismemberment of her body, that he just buried her at sea, which of course doesn't make sense because, even if you buried her at sea, there wouldn't have been a way for her body parts to have been deliberately cut off, put into bags, and then purposefully weighed down in separate locations so that they couldn't be found. So I don't know why it took him so long to admit that he had anything to do with dismembering her body, but he is still, to this day, trying to say that he had nothing to do with it, that he didn't kill her, she died of some sort of accident. Of course, his story has changed a couple of times at this point. He has claimed different accidents. He says that the content on that hard drive isn't his, that he has no idea how it got there, that a ton of people had access to it. It must have been somebody else. It's honestly all so strange. It has been very obvious since the moment that Kim Wall's torso was found that Madsen clearly had to have been the one that had done something to her. There is no other logical line of thinking for what could have happened to Kim. Especially the way that that her remains were scattered, essentially. He easily could have done that while he was in his submarine, just kind of going around all over the place while people were trying to find him, and he wasn't answering any sort of distress calls or anything. He wasn't getting into contact with anybody. There is so much strangeness about this case. And the reason that I wanted to present this case is because it's not quite as popular here in the United States. People aren't covering it as much over here, but it's getting a lot more coverage over in Europe. And I think it's really interesting. Even though it's very obvious who had to have done this, there isn't any other actual possible explanation. It's been proven that Kim Wall was not dropped off. She had to have died on the submarine. Of course, Madsen's stories don't line up. He keeps changing them. There's no reason to believe him. He has suspicious material that relates to her manner of death or dismemberment. To be clear, there was no official cause of death that was able to be determined. I assume that has a lot to do with the fact that there was the dismemberment, her body parts had been submerged in water, and then there was the stab wounds and everything, so it was probably, in general, just because of all of these different factors, kind of difficult to determine what had happened. But I thought this case was interesting, and I just wanted to bring it to your guys' attention. So I hope that you guys enjoyed today's case. I'm going to be keeping updated on it, and I will try to let you guys know if there's any new information that comes out. But I will see you guys again next week for new videos. I'm so sorry for being gone for so long, but I'm glad to be back. So thank you so much for being patient, everyone, and I will see you again soon for a new video. Bye!